In 1387, inside the cold halls of Denmark's court, young King Olaf II collapsed at just 17. His death came suddenly, too swift, too quiet. Some said fever, others whispered poison. A boy crowned in two kingdoms, yet never holding real power. His life was steered by his mother's hand. In the end, he was remembered not for rule, but for a crown that never truly belonged to him. The year was 1370, and the northern winds carried both promise and peril across Scandinavia. In Norway, a child was born into two dynasties, his tiny cry echoing within stone walls, heavy with centuries of ambition. He was Olaf Håkonsson, son of King Håkon VI of Norway and Margaret of Denmark, the only daughter of King Valdemar IV. From the moment of his birth, Olaf was less an infant than a symbol. His body, still fragile, was already the vessel of crowns, treaties, and the desperate hopes of two royal houses. Olaf's childhood was not like others. The nursery was a throne room in miniature. Cradles stood beneath banners embroidered with lions and crosses. His toys were carved of ivory, yet the weight of expectation lay heavier than any plaything. Even before he could walk, diplomats whispered his name. To them, Olaf was a bridge, the living bond between Norway and Denmark, a possible heir who could unite fractured lands under one lineage. When Olaf was just 5 years old, his grandfather, King Valdemar IV of Denmark, died without a surviving son. The Danish throne stood vacant, the air thick with rivalry. Denmark, weakened by years of conflict, needed stability. But its nobility was fractured, each lord eager to carve a piece of power for himself. It was Margaret, Olaf's mother, who stepped forward with a vision. She pressed her son's claim with relentless determination. She argued that Olaf, as Valdemar's grandson, should inherit the Danish crown. The nobility agreed, though reluctantly. They did not trust Margaret, but they feared the chaos of an empty throne more. Thus, in 1376, Olaf was crowned King of Denmark. He was barely 6 years old, his legs scarcely long enough to carry the weight of a royal robe. Witnesses recorded how he sat stiffly upon the throne, the crown oversized on his small head, the orb and scepter like props in the hands of a child actor on a stage too large. The nobles swore loyalty, but their eyes lingered not on Olaf, but on Margaret, sharp, calculating, already radiating the aura of a ruler. In truth, Olaf ruled in name only. It was his mother, Queen Margaret, who governed the realm. She moved with intelligence, weaving alliances, balancing noble factions, and rebuilding the fractured kingdom her father had left behind. While Olaf grew in years, he did not grow in authority. His signature appeared on charters, but it was Margaret's will that gave them shape. By 1380, tragedy altered Olaf's destiny yet again. His father, King Håkon VI of Norway, died, leaving the Norwegian throne vacant. Olaf, at just 10 years old, was declared King of Norway. In one sweep, he held two crowns, Denmark and Norway. Yet he could scarcely understand the burdens they carried. Once more, Margaret took command as regent, ruling both realms in her son's name. To courtiers and foreign emissaries, it was clear. Olaf was a king, but Margaret was the power. The boy himself remains a shadow in the chronicles. Unlike child monarchs who grew into fiery rulers, Olaf never found his own voice. His life was tightly managed, his movements orchestrated, his education directed toward the purpose of sustaining dynastic unity. Chroniclers mention little of his character, whether he was gentle, stubborn, or ambitious. Instead, he appears as a silent figure, standing at ceremonies, watching as his mother conducted affairs. In every painting, in every charter, Margaret is the presence that dominates. Yet beneath this silence was a storm of tension. Olaf represented not only hope, but fear. His dual crowns threatened to concentrate too much authority in a single dynasty. Danish nobles worried that Norway's interests would override their own. Norwegian lords whispered that Denmark would swallow them whole. And looming beyond Scandinavia was Sweden, restless and watchful, sensing both opportunity and threat. Olaf himself, barely in adolescence, bore the burden of these rivalries without fully comprehending them. At banquets, he sat at the high table, but conversations swirled above him. At councils, he was present, but decisions were made around him. He was the monarch of two kingdoms, yet the prisoner of expectations he could never escape. For a fleeting moment, however, there was hope. As Olaf neared adulthood, some wondered if he might finally assert himself. By the age of 16, he had begun to attend more ceremonies in his own right. His presence was noted in diplomatic exchanges. Rumors spread that he might soon marry, binding himself to another royal house and stepping out from his mother's shadow. Perhaps some thought he would grow into the ruler his lineage demanded. But history gave him no time. In the summer of 1387, Olaf fell ill. The records are brief, almost evasive. They speak of sudden fever, of a sickness that swept him away within days. Some claimed plague, others a violent infection. Yet the swiftness of his death raised whispers darker than disease. Many murmured that poison had been the cause. The timing was suspicious. With Olaf gone, Margaret could reign without obstacle. Within a decade, she would establish the Kalmar Union, uniting Denmark, Norway, and Sweden under her authority. Olaf was buried in Sorrow Abbey, far from the thunder of court intrigue. There were no grand processions, no triumphal farewell. His reign ended as it began, in silence, overshadowed by Margaret's towering presence. He left no heirs, no personal legacy, only the faint outline of a life consumed by others' ambitions. A boy king remembered not for his rule, but for his absence of it. From the moment Olaf drew his first breath, he was less a child than a chess piece. His birth in 1370 was celebrated with bells and feasts. But behind the joy, there lay calculation. He was not only the son of King Håkon VI of Norway, he was also the grandson of Valdemar IV, the last male of the Danish royal line. That blood made Olaf priceless. In an age where dynasties rose and crumbled on the slender thread of inheritance, Olaf was the golden link that could bind kingdoms together or tear them apart. His mother, Margaret, understood this more keenly than anyone. She had grown up watching her father struggle to hold Denmark together against rivals and foreign threats. She had seen firsthand the fragility of power when heirs were lacking. For Margaret, Olaf was not simply a son. He was destiny incarnate. She swaddled him not only in cloth, but in ambition, whispering lullabies laced with promises of thrones. But for Olaf himself, the weight was crushing. He never knew the freedom of anonymity, never played in fields as other children did. Instead, he grew beneath the vaulted ceilings of castles where guards watched every step, and tutors pressed lessons of kingship upon him before he could even hold a quill properly. His childhood was scripted, his every gesture molded to fit the silhouette of a monarch. Yet even in this carefully constructed world, one truth was inescapable. Olaf was king in name, but powerless in fact. The Danish nobles who accepted Olaf in 1376 did so with reluctance. They feared a child monarch. A boy could be molded, controlled, and perhaps discarded if convenient. But behind Olaf stood Margaret, a woman too clever, too strong-willed, too commanding to be ignored. Her presence unsettled them. In medieval Europe, a woman's political power was often tolerated only when cloaked in motherhood or widowhood. Margaret wore both cloaks at once, and she wore them with purpose. Thus, Olaf's throne was never truly his. Each decision he signed bore his name, but carried his mother's intent. Chroniclers describe Olaf's role as little more than ceremonial, appearing at feasts, riding in parades, sitting silently on a throne while Margaret addressed the court. Even in his teens, when other princes might have begun to assert their independence, Olaf seemed subdued, as though the flame of his own will had been dimmed by years of being overshadowed. Yet the dynastic stakes around him only grew higher. With the death of his father in 1380, Olaf inherited Norway. In theory, this made him the most powerful monarch in Scandinavia, uniting two crowns upon his head. In practice, it made him a symbol too dangerous for comfort. Danish nobles resented the thought of Norway influencing their kingdom. Norwegian lords feared their country becoming a Danish puppet. The boy king, who should have been the solution, became instead the source of unease. Foreign powers, too, watched closely. Sweden, restless and divided, saw both threat and opportunity in Olaf's dual inheritance. The Hanseatic League, ever eager to control Baltic trade, measured how best to exploit the shifting balance. Every gesture Olaf made, every alliance Margaret negotiated in his name, rippled across northern Europe like a stone in water. And Olaf himself? He remains a ghost in the record. His contemporaries rarely mention his words, his thoughts, or even his demeanor. Was he meek, resigned to his mother's dominance? Or was he frustrated, yearning for a chance to seize the power that should have been his? History is silent. The boy behind the crown is lost to us, overshadowed by Margaret's brilliance. Yet one detail emerges, like a faint echo. Olaf was a teenager when whispers of marriage began. Dynastic unions were the lifeblood of medieval Europe, and Olaf's position made him a coveted prize. Talk spread of potential brides, alliances with German principalities, with Sweden, even with England. A marriage might have been his first chance to step into his own role as king, to wield influence not as a child, but as a husband and future father. But fate allowed no such opening. By the summer of 1387, the pressure surrounding Olaf was immense. He was 17, approaching the threshold of adulthood, when illness struck. Accounts differ on the details. Some say he fell suddenly ill with fever. Others suggest a longer decline, a sickness that consumed him over weeks. The chroniclers are vague, as if unwilling or forbidden to speak plainly. What is certain is the shock of his death. A healthy young king, gone in the span of days. Official records list illness, perhaps plague or infection. But whispers began at once. Poison. Too many had reason to benefit from his absence. Most of all, Margaret. With Olaf dead, no longer would she rule as regent for her son. She would rule outright, and she would use that authority to achieve what had never been possible before: the union of Scandinavia under one crown. The Kalmar Union, sealed a decade later in 1397. Olaf's body was carried to Sorø Abbey, a monastery in Denmark. The funeral was somber but restrained. He was mourned, yet not immortalized. No great epics were composed for him. No chronicles exalted his reign. He was remembered instead as a shadow, a boy who had worn two crowns, yet never held them in his hands. His name faded into the margins of history, known chiefly for clearing the path his mother would walk. A dynasty had needed him. Politics had consumed him. And in the end, history forgot him. If Olaf II's life was brief, it was also defined almost entirely by a single figure, his mother, Margaret. To understand his fate, one must understand the woman who ruled through him. Margaret of Denmark had grown up in a world that doubted her. She was the youngest daughter of King Valdemar IV, a monarch who had clawed Denmark back from near ruin. With no surviving sons, Valdemar looked to daughters to secure alliances. Margaret, at the age of 10, was married off to Håkon VI of Norway, a match more political than affectionate. She left Denmark as a child bride, carrying with her her father's ambition and her nation's precarious future. Margaret proved herself quickly, intelligent, calculating, and deeply attuned to the rhythms of power. She absorbed the lessons of kingship from both her father and her husband. By the time Olaf was born, she already knew what was at stake. To her, Olaf was not merely a child. He was the continuation of her father's legacy. Through him, Denmark might survive and grow. Through him, Norway could be bound closer. Through him, she might shape all of Scandinavia. When Valdemar IV died in 1375, the Danish throne trembled on the edge of collapse. Nobles prepared to seize what they could. Neighboring powers circled like wolves. Margaret acted swiftly. She asserted Olaf's claim, presenting him as the natural heir. Innocent, untainted by politics, yet carrying the blood of two royal houses. It was a masterstroke. No lord could object without appearing to undermine the rightful bloodline. And so, though Olaf was only 5, he was crowned king. But it was Margaret who wielded the scepter. In the chronicles of the time, Margaret is described as shrewd and commanding, a woman who could outmaneuver noble factions with patience and cunning. She spoke with clarity, balanced rival interests, and above all, she radiated authority in a world where women were rarely allowed to rule. Her regency was no passive guardianship. She did not simply protect Olaf's throne until he came of age. She governed as though it were her own. For Olaf, this meant that every moment of his youth was shaped by her hand. His education was meticulously arranged, his counselors chosen by her, his public appearances orchestrated. Even his rare glimpses of authority, when he signed decrees or sat in council, were carefully staged to reflect her will. In portraits and records, Olaf appears as a presence, but Margaret is the force that animates the scene. It is tempting to imagine that he might have resented her dominance. What young man, crowned king of 2 realms, would not yearn to step into his own power? Yet history offers no evidence of rebellion, no accounts of Olaf clashing with his mother. Instead, there is only silence. Perhaps he was too bound by duty, too subdued by years of being overshadowed. Perhaps he admired her strength, even as it eclipsed his own. Or perhaps, like so many child monarchs, he never had the chance to grow into independence before death cut the thread short. Margaret, for her part, was relentless. She saw herself not merely as regent, but as the guardian of a grander vision. The unification of Scandinavia. Denmark and Norway were already bound through Olaf. Sweden, fractured by civil conflict, was vulnerable. If she could secure all 3 thrones, she could create a northern empire unlike anything seen before. Olaf was the linchpin of that plan. And yet, the irony was stark. The very son who embodied her ambitions was also the greatest obstacle. As long as Olaf lived, Margaret could only rule in his name. Her authority, though immense, was technically derivative. If Olaf reached adulthood, he might take the reins himself. And whether he followed her vision or forged his own was uncertain. The dynastic chessboard could be overturned in an instant. Thus, Olaf lived in the strangest of prisons. A king in title, but a child under constant watch. He attended ceremonies, but his words carried little weight. He wore crowns, but they pressed down heavier than iron chains. To the people, he was a distant figure, seen in processions, but never shaping their lives. To the nobles, he was a token to be maneuvered. To his mother, he was both hope and risk. The deeper tragedy is that Olaf remains invisible to us because he was invisible in his own time. His contemporaries did not record his speeches or his character. No anecdotes survive of youthful defiance or flashes of brilliance. The boy is absent, a shadow in his own reign. The chronicles speak instead of Margaret, her policies, her treaties, her triumphs. She was the mother who cast the shadow so completely that Olaf's light never reached the world. In 1380, when King Håkon VI of Norway died, Olaf inherited yet another crown. At 10 years old, he was king of both Denmark and Norway. But once again, it was Margaret who ruled. Now her influence stretched across 2 kingdoms. Nobles may have sworn oaths to Olaf, but their true loyalty, or at least their obedience, lay with her. She was the axis upon which the politics of Scandinavia turned. One can almost picture Olaf in those years, a youth dressed in finery, seated on gilded chairs, bowing his head at Mass, lifting a hand in ritual blessing, while beside him, Margaret spoke the words that mattered. To the crowd, Olaf was the symbol. To Margaret, he was the necessary vessel. To himself, perhaps, he was little more than an echo. By the time Olaf reached his late teens, there must have been whispers. When would he take command? When would the boy become a man, the figurehead become the ruler? The answer would never come. In 1387, he died, and Margaret stepped fully into the light. She was no longer regent, but sovereign in her own right. A decade later, she would formalize the Kalmar Union, uniting Denmark, Norway, and Sweden under her crown. The dream of her father, the legacy of her marriage, and the destiny she had molded through Olaf were realized, but without Olaf himself. And so, Margaret's shadow swallowed him entirely. His reign was her reign. His crowns became her crowns. His life, brief and dim, was the price of her empire. In medieval Europe, kingship was never a solitary crown. A monarch sat upon the throne only so long as his nobles allowed it. They were the men of land, armies, and coin. And without their support, even the most regal bloodline could wither. For Olaf II, this truth was felt from the very start. He was a boy surrounded not by companions, but by watchful lords, each one weighing him like a balance scale, judging whether he would serve their interests or threaten them. When the Danish council agreed in 1376 to crown Olaf, their oath of loyalty was thick with hesitation. They knew the risk of a child king. The throne would be in the hands of guardians. And in this case, the guardian was Margaret. Many feared her intelligence, her ability to sway factions, her stubborn will. The nobles did not bend to Olaf's innocence. They bent to the force of Margaret's will, hoping they might contain her through the pretense of loyalty to her son. But his nobles were not men of unity. Each carried private ambitions. Some sought new lands, others longed for influence over trade. Still others hungered for alliances with foreign powers. Olaf, in his dual inheritance, was both opportunity and danger. If he lived long enough to assert himself, he might centralize power, reduce the privileges of the lords, and restore authority to the crown. That was a risk the aristocracy did not wish to take. In Norway, the picture was similar, though painted in different colors. Norwegian nobles valued their independence, proud of their own traditions. Olaf, half Danish by blood, appeared to them as an intruder, a child imposed by foreign hands. They swore loyalty, yes, but it was fragile, a thin sheet of ice over deep waters. Behind their oaths lay suspicion, the fear that their kingdom would become merely a province under Danish rule. Thus, Olaf's reign, though only a teenager's lifetime, was a tightrope stretched across rivalries. At every feast, he sat above lords who toasted him with smiling lips but narrowed eyes. At every council, he faced noblemen whose courtesy was edged with calculation. He was king, yet perpetually on trial before those who considered themselves his equals. The boy himself, though silent in the chronicles, must have felt it. Imagine being 17, wrapped in regal robes, yet sensing that every laugh at court was not shared with you, but at you. That every bow of respect was hollow, concealing a blade. That every noble who swore allegiance did so only until a better arrangement could be found. For the aristocracy, Olaf's youth was both a gift and a curse. He was malleable, but he was also unpredictable. Would he follow Margaret's path, strengthening the monarchy at their expense? Would he one day raise armies loyal to himself, crushing their independence? Or would he perhaps turn weak, making himself irrelevant? To the nobles, each possibility carried its own peril. And then there was the specter of Sweden. That kingdom, restless and divided, looked upon Olaf's dual crowns with unease. Swedish lords feared being encircled by Denmark and Norway under a single monarch. They whispered to Danish nobles, fanning their anxieties, urging them not to let Olaf's rule harden into permanence. Thus, Olaf's very existence stirred international intrigue. Foreign emissaries crossed the Baltic, sowing doubts, offering promises, quietly undermining a boy king who had never yet spoken with the voice of authority. In this atmosphere, Margaret's presence loomed larger still. To some nobles, she was a stabilizer, holding the realm steady while Olaf matured. To others, she was a manipulator, consolidating power under the guise of maternal regency. And to the most ambitious, she was simply an obstacle, a figure to be endured until circumstances shifted. What is striking is that Olaf himself left no trace of resistance to this web. Unlike child kings who broke free of their guardians, asserting authority with sudden vigor, Olaf never emerged. Whether by temperament or circumstance, he remained ensnared. He rode in parades, signed decrees, attended councils, yet history records no decision truly his own. He lived as if within a cage made not of iron bars, but of noble expectations, political schemes, and a mother's shadow. But the nobles, for all their caution, did not anticipate how swiftly the story would end. In 1387, when Olaf died at 17, it was as if a trap door opened beneath the political stage. Nobles who had feared his growing independence found themselves stunned at the abruptness of his fall. Some whispered relief, others suspicion. Was it truly fever, as the records claimed? Or had Margaret, or some faction within the court, decided that the risk of Olaf reaching maturity was too great? The rumors of poison thrived because they suited the anxieties of the age. If Olaf had simply succumbed to sickness, then fate alone had struck. But if he had been poisoned, then it was politics. Nobles and regents playing the darkest of games. And in truth, the outcome suited too many. Olaf's death removed the uncertainty of a young king's future. Margaret, free of her regency, stepped into direct authority. The nobles, though wary of her, no longer had to contend with the unpredictable transformation of a boy into a man. Olaf, then, was mourned, but not cherished. He was buried with formality, but without fervor. He was remembered as necessary, but never as beloved. For the nobles of Denmark and Norway, his death was not a tragedy to be lamented, but a shift in the balance of power. He was a pawn removed from the board, his absence more convenient than his presence had ever been. And thus, the boy king's life ended as it had been lived, surrounded by lords whose loyalty was never to him, but only to themselves. The summer of 1387 should have been a turning point for Olaf II. At 17, he stood on the edge of manhood, close to stepping out from his mother's regency into independent rule. Whispers had begun to circulate in court. Who would he marry? Which alliances would he forge? What kind of king would he become once Margaret's shadow lifted? But before any answers could take shape, death silenced the questions. It began quietly. Chroniclers write of a sudden illness, fever striking the young king with little warning. Some sources describe chills and weakness. Others simply note sickness. In an age before medical precision, such vague accounts were common. Illnesses swept through Europe regularly: plague, influenza, fever. Death often came swiftly, yet Olaf's decline carried an unusual sharpness. A boy of 17, vigorous and young, was struck down in mere days. The shock rippled across Denmark and Norway. People had expected Olaf's adulthood to mark a new chapter. Instead, they awoke to find their king gone, his body lying still within chambers that had once echoed with his hesitant steps. To the common folk, it was tragedy. To the nobles, it was opportunity. And to Margaret, it was release. Official records declared that Olaf died of illness. This was the safe explanation, the one that required no further inquiry. But rumors bloomed like weeds in the silence left behind. Some whispered plague, though no widespread outbreak was noted at that moment. Others suggested food poisoning, an infection, or fever. And then came the darker murmurs. Poison. Why poison? Because the timing was too perfect. Olaf had just reached the age when he might claim his throne in truth. He might step into independence, assert his will, perhaps resist the very mother who had ruled in his name. His sudden death cleared the path for Margaret to govern without obstacle. Within a decade, she would create the Kalmar Union, binding Denmark, Norway, and Sweden together under her sole authority. To those watching, the convenience was difficult to ignore. The rumor of poison has never been proven. Medieval courts were fertile ground for suspicion, where every untimely death was seen through the lens of intrigue. But the whispers clung to Olaf's memory, growing with each retelling. Some said nobles, fearing a strong monarch, arranged his end. Others claimed Margaret herself had sacrificed her son to gain full control. Neither accusation was substantiated, yet both spoke to the unease of a boy king's sudden fall. At Sorrow Abbey, where Olaf was buried, the atmosphere was heavy but restrained. There were prayers, solemn processions, the echo of chants across stone halls. Yet the mourning lacked grandeur. He was a king, yes, but one who had never ruled in his own right. His funeral did not shake kingdoms. It merely sealed a transition already underway. Margaret was the true ruler, and now she no longer needed a son's name to justify her power. For Denmark and Norway, Olaf's death carried practical consequences. The dynastic line through him ended abruptly. He left no bride, no heirs, no continuation of the Håkonsson blood. Instead, his passing funneled all legitimacy into Margaret's hands. She would be hailed as the Lady and Mistress of Denmark, a rare title for a woman of the 14th century. The boy who had once embodied dynastic hope now became the reason his mother could rule outright. Yet beneath the politics, the tragedy remains deeply human. Olaf was 17, still on the cusp of life, still more boy than man. Imagine the weight he carried. 2 crowns, a divided nobility, a mother whose will eclipsed his own. And then imagine the sudden extinguishing of that fragile existence, whether by fever or by human hands. A candle snuffed before it ever truly burned. The nobles, for their part, wasted little time in reflection. They adjusted swiftly, aligning themselves with Margaret. Whatever grief they expressed was formal, perfunctory. To them, Olaf had been less a person than a placeholder, a name on charters, a figurehead for power struggles. His absence was not destabilizing, it was clarifying. The game could now proceed without the complication of a maturing king. But for history, the consequences were profound. Olaf's death transformed him from potential monarch to forgotten monarch. His reign of 11 years left no laws, no victories, no reforms. Only a memory of ceremonies attended and documents signed in his name. If not for the rumors that surrounded his end, he might have disappeared entirely from historical memory. The suspicion of poison, whether true or not, ensured that Olaf remained a figure of intrigue. The idea of a mother sacrificing her son for power, or nobles disposing of a king to preserve their privileges, gave his story a haunting resonance. It fit the narrative of medieval politics, where crowns were gained not only through bloodlines, but through daggers and cups laced with venom. Yet perhaps the greater tragedy is not whether Olaf was poisoned, but how little it mattered. Whether fever or intrigue, his death provoked no outcry, no war of succession, no rebellion. It was accepted, almost quietly, as though the world had already decided he was dispensable. The crown passed not to another man, but to the woman who had wielded it all along. Olaf had been king, but never master. His death proved it. At 17, his story ended where it had begun, in silence, overshadowed by Margaret's enduring will. In every medieval court, death was never just death. It was a mirror, reflecting not only grief, but suspicion, ambition, and fear. The sudden passing of Olaf II at 17 ignited such a mirror across Scandinavia. Though chronicles list illness as the cause, few in the courts of Denmark and Norway accepted the words at face value. They whispered instead of poison. The theory clung to the shadows because it explained what simple fever could not: timing. Olaf had just reached the edge of adulthood, poised to take power for himself. His mother's regency was nearing its end. Nobles watched carefully, wondering whether he would honor their privileges or challenge them. The boy king was about to become a man. And then, with startling speed, he was gone. Poison was the natural suspicion in a world where political killings often came not with swords, but with chalices. In the 14th century, medicine could not distinguish between natural illness and deliberate poisoning. A sudden fever, a wasting sickness, even convulsions could be attributed to venom or to plague. It was all the same mystery to medieval physicians. What mattered was perception, and perception saw Margaret's hand everywhere. Margaret, after all, had everything to gain. With Olaf alive, she ruled only in his name. With Olaf dead, she ruled in her own right. His death erased the awkward balance between a boy king and a mother regent. No longer did she have to wait for him to assert himself, or risk her influence waning as he matured. She was now the undisputed sovereign, free to pursue the grand design she had long envisioned, a united Scandinavia. It is important to note that no proof of poison exists. The chronicles are frustratingly vague. Some hint at illness spreading in the region, others are silent, as if reluctant to commit. To declare poison outright would have been to accuse the most powerful woman in Scandinavia, a dangerous act. Silence was safer. But silence also left space for rumor, and rumor proved stronger than fact. In taverns and noble halls alike, stories circulated. Some claimed that a goblet of wine had been tampered with. Others insisted that a meal prepared in haste carried the fatal dose. Still others whispered that it was not Margaret at all, but ambitious nobles who sought to avoid the rise of a strong monarch. Poison was not a single story, but a spectrum of suspicions, each tailored to the anxieties of those who told it. The effect was the same. Olaf's death was never seen as purely natural. He became, in memory, the boy who had been erased. Whether erased by fate, by disease, or by human hands, the distinction mattered less than the impression left behind. For Margaret, this perception was both curse and crown. On one hand, she carried the unspoken accusation of having benefited too greatly from her son's death. On the other, she did not allow whispers to stall her ambitions. She stepped forward with unshakable resolve, assuming authority with a confidence that silenced opposition. If poison had been suspected, it was never proven. If rumors swirled, they swirled powerlessly against her rising tide. A decade later, Margaret would achieve what no man before her had managed: the Kalmar Union. Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, long divided by rivalries and wars, were united under one crown. Her reign earned her the title the Semiramis of the North and the Lady King. It was an unprecedented triumph for a woman in medieval Europe. Yet that triumph rested on a foundation built in silence. Silence left by a son's early grave. Olaf, by contrast, was remembered less for who he was than for how he died. The whispers of poison became his legacy. He was the king who never reigned, the boy whose very existence seemed inconvenient to those around him. His absence was more powerful than his presence had ever been. In this sense, the poison, whether real or imagined, became symbolic. It represented the crushing weight of dynastic politics, the expendability of youth in the service of ambition, the ease with which a crown could be gained or lost through a single breath. The tragedy deepens when one considers how little we know of Olaf himself. Unlike other medieval rulers, he left behind no speeches, no letters, no chronicled deeds. His life is recorded only in titles and dates. Crowned in 1376, King of Norway in 1380, dead in 1387. The humanity of the boy vanishes into the shadow of his mother. His voice is silent, replaced by the echo of rumors. And yet, the whispers preserved him. Without them, Olaf might have vanished entirely into the dust of forgotten monarchs. With them, he lingers in history as a figure of mystery, his story bound to suspicion, his name recalled whenever the fragility of power is discussed. The nobles, too, shaped this narrative. They had little reason to defend him, for his death left them unthreatened by a maturing king. They allowed the rumors to persist, perhaps even encouraged them, for they explained away the awkward truth that a boy who could have united Scandinavia died before his promise could be tested. Better to blame poison than to confront the sheer cruelty of chance. In the end, Olaf's legacy became the shadow of Margaret's brilliance. She is remembered as the founder of the Kalmar Union, the ruler who defied gender and tradition to forge a northern empire. He is remembered as the stepping stone she stood upon. The whispers of poison bind them together forever. The mother rising, the sun falling, one legacy consuming the other. Olaf's story is thus not only a tale of a boy king's death. It is a meditation on memory itself. How history chooses to recall or forget those who pass too soon. How silence can be louder than words, and how rumors, once loosed, can become the only voice the dead are allowed to have. When Olaf II of Denmark and the IV of Norway died in 1387, he left behind not just a vacant throne, but a void at the heart of Scandinavia's dynastic future. He had no wife, no children, no heirs. His death, sudden and unexplained, was not simply the end of a life, it was the collapse of a lineage. For medieval monarchies, heirs were more than family. They were continuity, stability, the assurance that kingdoms would not crumble with the passing of one generation. Olaf's death shattered that chain. The bloodline that connected Denmark to Norway, carefully secured through his birth, snapped in an instant. There was no son of Håkon VI left to inherit, no grandson of Valdemar IV to claim the Danish throne. The fragile bridge between two realms dissolved like frost in morning light. In another age, this might have sparked chaos. Factions competing for the crown, rival claimants emerging from distant branches of royal houses, civil war spilling across the north. But in Olaf's case, something remarkable happened. Instead of collapse, there was consolidation. Instead of disorder, there was a single figure ready to step into the void. Margaret. The nobles of Denmark, wary though they had been of her dominance, recognized her strength. She had ruled effectively in her son's name for over a decade. The kingdom was stable, its treasury balanced, its rivals held at bay. Why gamble on an unknown claimant when the woman already in power had proven herself capable? And so they proclaimed Margaret all-powerful lady and mistress of Denmark. It was a title without precedent, one that bent the rules of kingship to accommodate a woman whose authority could no longer be ignored. In Norway, the response was much the same. Olaf had been king by blood, but it was Margaret who had governed. With him gone, Norwegian nobles saw little choice but to confirm her as their regent once more, this time not in her son's name, but in her own. Step by step, crown by crown, she tightened her grasp. The absence of an heir did not weaken Margaret. It freed her. No longer did she need to hide behind Olaf's figure. She no longer ruled through the fiction of guardianship. The dynastic void gave her direct power, unmediated by a child's presence. Olaf's death cleared the board, and Margaret moved her piece with precision. Still, the question lingered. What of Sweden? That kingdom, fractured by internal strife, had long resisted both Danish and Norwegian influence. But Olaf's passing and Margaret's assumption of power altered the balance. She saw an opportunity to extend her dominion even further. Within a decade, she would maneuver herself into the position of regent in Sweden as well, culminating in the Kalmar Union of 1397. A political creation that bound the three Scandinavian crowns under one ruler. It is striking to realize that this entire arc, from Olaf's birth as dynastic hope to Margaret's union of the North, was shaped by the absence of heirs. Olaf had been the vessel of continuity. His death made continuity impossible. And yet, rather than destroy the monarchy, it redefined it. Instead of dynastic succession, power now flowed through political cunning. Instead of inheritance, it was ambition that shaped the map. For Olaf, this was the cruelest irony. His life had been consumed by the expectation that he would be the bridge of dynasties. His childhood was measured in treaties and promises, his adolescence in carefully managed ceremonies. He was raised not for himself, but for the heirs he would one day produce. And yet he never married, never sired children, never fulfilled the role carved out for him before he could even speak. His death at 17 was not only the end of a boy, it was the end of a dynasty. The silence of that absence haunted the court. Nobles did not weep for Olaf's unrealized potential. They worried about what his lack of heirs meant for their own futures. Without a dynastic chain to bind them, they turned to the one figure who could preserve stability. Margaret became, in their eyes, both mother and monarch, protector of the crown, but also its living embodiment. The chronicles reflect this shift. Olaf fades quickly from their pages after 1387. A brief mention at his burial, a line noting his reign. Margaret, by contrast, dominates the narrative. She is described negotiating treaties, defeating rivals, shaping alliances. Where Olaf had been a silent symbol, Margaret became a roaring presence. His absence was her opportunity. And yet, one must ask, did Margaret grieve? Did she, in the quiet of her chambers, mourn her only child? Or did the political calculus overwhelm maternal sorrow? The records are silent, but the image is haunting. A mother rising to absolute power at the very moment she lost her son. Whether she saw Olaf's death as tragedy or necessity, history cannot tell. What it can tell is this: she did not falter. Olaf, meanwhile, was buried at Sorø Abbey in Denmark. His grave, though royal, was modest compared to what might have been expected for a monarch who carried two crowns. There were prayers and rituals, but no monumental remembrance. His legacy was not written in stone, but in absence. In the heirs he never produced, in the line that ended with him, in the dynasty that dissolved into his mother's ambition. A crown without an heir is like a candle without flame, hollow, fragile, vulnerable to the winds. Olaf's death at 17 left such a candle. Margaret seized it, shielding it in her hands, and used it to light an empire. And so Olaf's name was carried forward not in glory, but as a footnote to the story of the woman who replaced him. His life ended where hers began. His absence was her presence. His forgotten crown became her enduring legacy. The year 1387 marked the end of Olaf's short reign, but it also marked the beginning of something far larger. His sudden death left Scandinavia in a peculiar position. Two kingdoms without a direct heir, yet held steady under the iron will of a woman who had already proven herself more than capable of ruling. That woman was Margaret, Olaf's mother, and she would transform his absence into the foundation of a northern empire. To the outside world, it looked almost seamless. Within months of Olaf's burial, Margaret was confirmed as the ruler of Denmark and Norway, not as regent for her son, but as sovereign in her own right. Her titles were extraordinary for their time: all-powerful lady and mistress, phrases that broke the conventions of medieval kingship. She was no placeholder, no caretaker. She was the throne itself. Yet power never rested quietly. The nobles who had tolerated Olaf's kingship did so largely because he was malleable. Margaret, however, was neither child nor figurehead. She was deliberate, strategic, and unafraid to wield her authority. Many lords bristled at the idea of a woman ruling them directly, but her competence silenced open dissent. She balanced factions with care, ensuring that no group of nobles gained too much influence. She relied on loyal advisors, often drawn from the lesser aristocracy rather than the great magnates, a strategy that kept the proudest families in check. But Margaret's ambitions extended beyond holding Denmark and Norway together. Her vision was continental in scale. She remembered her father, Valdemar IV, who had dreamed of restoring Denmark's strength after years of decline. She saw Sweden, fractured by noble quarrels and weakened by unpopular monarchs, as vulnerable. If she could bring Sweden into her orbit, she could bind all three crowns of Scandinavia into a single realm. This dream would become the Kalmar Union. The Union, formalized in 1397 in the Swedish town of Kalmar, was not just a treaty. It was a statement that the kingdoms of the North could act as one against the powers of Europe. United, they would resist the encroachment of the Hanseatic League, balance the influence of Germany, and secure their place in the shifting politics of the late Middle Ages. It was an extraordinary achievement, something no man had managed before, and it was made possible by the death of a 17-year-old boy. Olaf had been raised as the link between Denmark and Norway. His very existence had embodied dynastic continuity, but with his sudden death, the continuity broke. Margaret stepped into the void not as mother of a king, but as king herself. She ruled not through inheritance, but through sheer will and political skill. The union she forged would last, in various forms, for more than a century. The cost, however, was Olaf's memory. In the chronicles of the Kalmar Union, his name is little more than a prelude, a necessary step before Margaret's ascendancy. He is the monarch who died too young, the king who never ruled, the forgotten child behind the woman remembered as one of Europe's greatest queens. This forgetting was not accidental. Margaret had little incentive to preserve his memory. Her legitimacy rested on her own ability, not on the shadow of her son. To dwell on Olaf would have been to dwell on fragility, on the possibility of dynastic collapse. Instead, she presented herself as the source of stability, the one who had carried Denmark and Norway through crisis into triumph. The boy became background. The mother became legend. And yet, the silence around Olaf made the whispers of his end all the louder. Rumors of poison persisted long after his death. Some said Margaret had orchestrated it, though no evidence ever surfaced. Others suggested rival nobles had acted, fearing a strong king. Whatever the truth, the suspicion attached itself to the Kalmar Union like a shadow at its foundation. It was as though the union was built not only on treaties and oaths, but on a grave. In this way, Olaf's absence continued to haunt the present. He was not remembered for his deeds, he had none, but for his disappearance. The boy whose face was painted on banners, whose name was inscribed on charters, became the ghost that enabled an empire. He was erased from history's spotlight, yet always there in the margins, the silent cost of unity. Margaret, of course, pressed forward with unrelenting confidence. She styled herself not as queen consort or regent, but as ruler in her own right, an almost unprecedented claim for a woman in medieval Europe. She commanded armies, negotiated treaties, and balanced the jealousies of three kingdoms. Her reign was long enough to solidify the union, though not without conflict. Sweden, in particular, resisted, and rebellions flared in later years. Still, the vision of a united Scandinavia endured. When historians write of Margaret, they speak of brilliance. They call her the Lady King, a title that both acknowledged and transgressed the norms of gender and power. They celebrate her creation of the Kalmar Union as a feat of statecraft unmatched in the North. But when they speak of Olaf, it is almost always in passing. His story is a parenthesis, a footnote, and that, perhaps, is the deepest tragedy. For while Margaret became immortal in memory, Olaf became forgotten. He died not only in body, but in history. His brief life, consumed by dynastic expectation, ended before it began. His legacy was absorbed into his mother's triumph. The Kalmar Union, magnificent as it was, carried with it the ghost of a boy who had been meant to inherit, but instead became the sacrifice that allowed his mother to rule. The dream of unity was real, but it was built on loss, the cost of a son. History is not always fair. Some figures loom across centuries, their names etched in chronicles, their deeds sung in ballads. Others fade into silence, their lives reduced to footnotes, their memories blurred into the margins. Olaf II of Denmark, Olaf IV of Norway, belongs to the second kind. At 17, his death should have inspired grief, memorials, and remembrance. He was the last direct heir of two royal lines, the bridge between Denmark and Norway, the boy who carried the hopes of a dynasty. Yet when he died, his memory was treated with startling brevity. He was buried, honored, and almost immediately forgotten. Why? The first reason was his youth. Olaf had not lived long enough to leave a mark. He had signed decrees, yes, but none bore his vision. He had sat upon thrones, but only as a child. He had worn 2 crowns, but never truly wielded them. Unlike child kings who lived into adulthood, leaving traces of character or policy, Olaf left behind no legacy of his own. His reign was Margaret's reign. His voice was Margaret's voice. When he died, there was no story of Olaf to tell, only the story of the woman who succeeded him. The second reason was the brilliance of that successor. Margaret was a figure of such force that she eclipsed her son entirely. In the chronicles of the Kalmar Union, Olaf appears only as a stepping stone, a necessary prelude to her triumph. Where his name surfaces, it is as the boy who died, or the son of Margaret. He is remembered not for himself, but for what his death allowed her to accomplish. His identity dissolved into hers. The third reason was political necessity. For Margaret to establish her authority securely, it was useful to downplay Olaf's memory. To dwell on his death would have raised questions about succession, about legitimacy, about the rumors of poison that never quite died away. Better to let his name fade than to let it stir doubts. Better to present a future built on unity than to mourn the boy who had represented fragility. Thus, Olaf's memory dwindled. There were no great epics, no monumental tombs. He was laid to rest at Sorrow Abbey, a respectable resting place, but one that did not elevate him to lasting grandeur. Visitors to the abbey in later centuries passed his grave without pause, focusing instead on other figures more vividly remembered. Even in Norway, where he was the son of King Haakon VI, Olaf's name faded quickly. His father had been the last male of the Norwegian royal line. With Olaf's death, that line ended. The crown passed into Margaret's hands and then into the Kalmar Union. Olaf was the last link in a chain. But people do not sing of broken links. They sing of the new chain that replaced it. And so, Olaf became a ghost in the chronicles. When historians list the kings of Denmark and Norway, his name is included, but briefly, often skipped over. He ruled, they write, from 1376 to 1387 in Denmark, from 1380 to 1387 in Norway. 11 years, 2 crowns, and almost no trace. Yet if Olaf himself vanished from memory, the circumstances of his death lingered like an echo. The rumors of poison persisted through generations. Historians debated, speculated, searched for clues. Some insisted it was plague, others fever. still others intrigue. The lack of certainty gave the story its haunting quality. He was not remembered for deeds, but for doubts. Not for victories, but for questions. His very absence became his identity. There is tragedy in this erasure. Imagine being born into a crown, raised beneath banners, taught from infancy that you carry the hopes of kingdoms, only to die before ever shaping them. Imagine knowing that your name will live on, but not for what you did, for what was done around you. Olaf was raised as a king, but he became a shadow, defined not by his reign, but by his removal from it. And yet, perhaps this is why his story endures, faint though it may be. He represents a theme older than kingdoms, the fragility of human ambition. Olaf's life reminds us that dynasties can collapse not in war or rebellion, but in silence, in sickness, in whispers of poison in a cup. He stands as a symbol of how power can consume the very children it rests upon. In the centuries that followed, the Kalmar Union itself would fracture. Sweden would resist. Rebellions would tear at the fabric of unity, and the dream Margaret had forged would struggle to endure. But Olaf remained where he had always been, in the shadows. He did not become a national hero, nor a symbol of resistance. He became something quieter, a forgotten boy king whose very obscurity testifies to how easily history discards those who die too soon. It is fitting, in a way, that his grave at Sorrow Abbey lies in a monastery. Monks there prayed in silence, their chants echoing through stone corridors, their voices fading into stillness. Olaf's memory mirrors that rhythm. Brief, echoing, then gone. But silence too can speak. And when we look back at Olaf's life, we do not see deeds or victories. We see the outline of absence. We see a crown without a king, a dynasty without an heir, a story without an ending. And in that absence, there is meaning. For sometimes, history remembers not only through triumphs, but through tragedies left unfinished. Olaf II was forgotten in his own time. Yet in being forgotten, he became a symbol of how fragile kingship truly was. In the end, Olaf II was not remembered for what he did, but for what he never had the chance to become. A boy crowned too young, a king without power, a life ended before its story began. His silence allowed his mother to change history, yet his absence speaks just as loudly. Olaf reminds us that even forgotten lives carry meaning, and that every crown rests on fragile human breath.